Fall 2023 has got to be the home to the biggest inventory of anime in a single season, with 59 new TV shows. Now I'm not going to watch all of them, since some of them don't actually interest me at all, or some are sequels to shows I haven't seen. But for those that I do watch, this is 3 episodes in, where I give my first impressions of a show after the first 3 episodes. And as a warning, there may be some spoilers, so I may properly express my opinions. 16-Bit Sensation is a workplace comedy involving time travel. The premise is that the protagonist is an illustrator who loves bishoujo games. She currently works at a video game studio, but the work is much different to what she had imagined. Initially, the show seemed to be about exploring the decline of modern video games as an art form, and about the process of making a bishoujo game in the 90s. But it's quickly clear that the show lacks a solid direction. There isn't much exploration into what the protagonist likes about bishoujo games, so viewers are left with a clumsy, floundering protagonist. And when she does travel back in time, and we get a glimpse of what developing a bishoujo game would have been like, she is returned back into the present briefly, which didn't contribute to the story in a meaningful way. The other characters are also not that interesting, which makes the pacing of the show feel a little sluggish and tedious. As for the opening, the song sounds a little amateurish, which may be intentional, while the sequencing feels a little scattered. As for the ending, it fits the theme of the show, but still remains unremarkable. Overall, I can't recommend it. Atarashii Joushi is a slice-of-life comedy with the theme of a workplace. The premise is that our protagonist has changed his job due to harassment by his former boss. He fears repeating the experience at his new workplace, but is pleasantly surprised when his boss is actually an airhead. So the two main characters being men should already give off suspicions on what types of themes or misunderstandings there will be. And of course, it's homo-baiting. But compared to if it were 2 females, the fan service is fairly tame. However, even if you do like this type of fan service, you may not actually like the actual contents of the show, as the airheaded incidents that the boss makes are relatively insignificant, which is kind of expected, given that both characters are relatively older adults. But that's kind of also why the show isn't all that interesting. All the incidents are fairly likely to happen to anyone, which makes it believable, but uninteresting. The character development between the two is also fairly minor, maintaining just as a professional relationship. As for the opening, it's okay. I think the sequencing fits the theme of the show, although it does feel somewhat flat with the chosen song. As for the ending, I think it's a bit better, with it almost feeling like a getting off work sort of tone, which, again, fits the theme of the show. Overall, I can't strongly recommend this, as it's just not that interesting or funny enough to me. Ameiro Protocol is an action drama using video games as its theme. The premise is that our protagonist is a good player of a particular game, but stopped after his father was killed and his sister injured in an accident. He has since then spent his time either studying or working at his childhood friend's esports cafe. Upon discovering that the cafe is in debt, he decides to enter the game's championship in order to win the prize money and save the store. So let's start with the focus of the story, the game. And let's just say it looks like an asset flip. Usually, in shows that are heavily video game focused, the game itself will be drawn no differently from the rest of the show, regardless of whether it was VR or not. However, since the game itself is done so terribly, it's hard to get immersed into the actual gameplay. This then bleeds into the drama, which is centered around the skill of the players. It's a hard sell to say these are good players when the game is presented as an asset flip of Valorant, which the show probably presumes that the audience is already familiar with. As for the opening, it's okay. The sequencing fits the song, though not sure if it really fits the theme of the show. As for the ending, I like the sequencing more, although it did feel a bit generic since it could be applied to any other drama. Overall, I would not recommend this show, as the core of the show just isn't passable. Boushoku no Berserk is an action-adventure fantasy with some hints of romance. However, the show could be more easily described as a high schooler isekai without the isekai. So let's start with the main character. He is plain looking, has low social status, and has a skill that he and other people thought were useless, but is in fact very powerful. He also comes across a powerful sword that was in a junk pile, and has a love interest who is at the top of the social hierarchy. If you thought he fit all of the checkboxes of the generic, bland, but powerful male protagonist, there's actually one thing you're forgetting. He's also incredibly dumb. The protagonist needs to constantly have everything explained to him by his talking sword, even though he should literally know it because he experienced it. Take for example, he wonders why he suddenly feels hungry again, even though he both realized and had it explained to him earlier on. he will actively talk to his sword in front of other people, which makes it look like he was directing the comments towards them, and yet not actually adapt when called out. Dialogue flow is also sometimes incoherently terrible. It's almost like watching a player make dialogue choices, with NPCs who just accept whatever comes out. As for the opening, it is probably the most generic of the season. It's just a bunch of still shots or characters swinging their weapons and walking. As for the ending, it's a bit better, but still not worth watching a second time. Overall, skipping this show is actually an advice, as paying attention to it might actually decrease your intelligence from how dumb it is. Bullbuster is an action mecha set in a relatively contemporary period. The premise is that some unknown large creatures have suddenly shown up on an island, and our protagonist has joined a company whose aim is to get rid of them, so that the original inhabitants can return and continue their original lives. However, the show quickly shows how constrained the plot is. First, you think that large unknown creatures that suddenly show up would be the central focus of the show, with everything else revolving around it. But that's not the case, because it seems like no one actually cares about the creatures themselves. The ones who are dissecting and researching the corpses that the company brings don't seem to care that they're dealing with unknown organisms. The company getting rid of these creatures don't actually care about the creatures, but simply help the displaced inhabitants. Then, the inhabitants themselves don't actually care about what the large creatures are. They simply want to return to the island and live their original lives. And while the cast of characters are interesting, we are left with just boring forced drama due to the limiting premise. As for the opening, it is decent. The first half feels very well done and creative, while the latter half just feels a bit generic. As for the ending, it's more consistent than the opening, though more simplistic. However, I do not hate it as it offers a different feel from the opening. Overall, I can't recommend this show as the limits prevent anything really interesting to show up. Buta no Liver is an isekai comedy. The premise is that after eating a raw pig liver, the protagonist wakes up to find himself in another world in the body of a pig. He is unable to talk since he is now a pig, but luckily for him, the servant girl who is tending to the pig pen is able to read minds, and thus begins the adventure and relationship between the pig and the servant girl. Now if this reminds you of that dog anime a few seasons back, well, it's not anything like that. First, there's not much fan service going on, despite the protagonist continually making perverted comments towards the girl. The first episode was also really boring, because there was just so much dialogue, most of which were just filled by the protagonist's perverted comments. The second and third episodes, however, have opened up the world a bit more, showcasing some of the fantasy elements of the show. As for the opening, it's good, with some nice sequences and fits the show. As for the ending, it's much simpler, though I do not dislike it. Overall, while the art is nice, the story probably won't offer enough to be that interesting, so I can't recommend it. Dekoboko is a slice-of-life comedy in a fantasy setting. The two main characters are a 200-year-old lolly witch, who is also the adoptive mother of the other main character, a 16-year-old human. There's not too much to comment as the basis of the episodes are fairly standard, varying between the typical slice-of-life activities with a magical twist, interaction with friends, and backstory flashbacks. There is also a bit of fan service, and jokes that are unoriginal but still enjoyable because they are executed in an appropriate manner. The opening and endings are decently entertaining and fitting for the type of show, both having an upbeat type of song, with the sequences not lacking in creativity either. Overall, it is a familiar type of show, which, as a seasonal watch, I would say is acceptably enjoyable. Sousou no Frieren is a show that is more of a slice of life, with some fantasy adventuring mixed in, and is set from the perspective of Frieren, an elf. The pacing is gently slow, yet also incredibly fast, with months, years and even decades being skipped at a time, which is all very appropriate, because what a decade is to Frieren is probably what a month is to a human, and it is that mismatch of time perspective that brings out the conflict in Frieren's life, which is that she wants to get to know people better. The animation is unexpectedly phenomenal. The background has a lot of movement, where most studios would simply make everything but the focus characters static. And the combat is not just cheap looking effects which then simply flash to the attack's aftermath. There is a build-up, release and a conclusion. What makes the pacing slow is that not too much happens at a time, but what makes it fast is the context that surrounds the event. For example, the rapid changing of colours due to the seasons helps emphasize how Frieren experiences time, so the world may be a lush green one moment, then the yellow and red in the next. Another example is how a particular demon that Frieren first encountered was widely considered dangerous because of the attack that it developed, but after the passage of time, the attack is now considered just normal. For the opening, it felt a little weird and out of place, given the theme and plot of the story. It was just a bit too upbeat, but the ending was more appropriate and uniquely styled. Overall, I found the show enjoyable, but would say that it is definitely not for everyone. It doesn't have much action, comedy, or even the more usual fun aspects of a slice of life. But if you're on the fence about whether to watch this or not, I would say give it a try. Hametsu no Oukoku is an action drama in a science fantasy setting. The premise of the show is that scientific advancements have made magic obsolete, and so the king of the Radia Empire then makes use of this to persecute against witches, as he views magic as a source of oppression, which leads to our protagonist, a human that can use magic, who vows to take revenge on the kingdom after watching his teacher's death. The story is edgy. It does not shy away from depicting violence, and uses it to justify the protagonist's goal, to which I'll say it does so successfully. The deaths in the show are well done, because characters aren't overly introduced before dying a quick death, nor are they rescued in a convenient manner. And while the characters and mannerisms are all kind of cheesy, the deaths prevent the overall show from feeling cheesy. So far, the show is starting to open up, as there are hints on the larger implications on what persecuting witches and eliminating magic has had on the world, and how limited scientific knowledge actually is. As for the opening, it's okay. Some of the sequences are interesting, but other parts feel very generic. As for the ending, it is very simplistic. Overall, I can recommend this show if you're okay with some gore. Hikikomari Kyuuketsuki is a comedy fantasy. The premise is that our protagonist is a shut-in vampire, who one day finds out she has been appointed as a commander in the army, and if she fails in her duty, she will lose her head. However, she is incredibly weak for a vampire, and must rely on her trusty appointed maid to help her keep up a fast, lest the soldiers she commands rebel against her. The comedy in the show is pretty typical, with the only jokes being the usual sexual teasing, and how the weak protagonist successfully pretends to be strong because of someone else's interference or because of luck. However, the show is also quite dark, as in the later episodes it explores the sadistic bullying that the protagonist suffered, and it's also where the comedy comes to a stop. The show also kind of lacks interesting stakes or an interesting direction, as it seems like the main gimmick it relies on is that its protagonist is a cute lolly vampire. As for the opening, it's kind of what you'd expect from this type of show, without falling into the generic category. However, it is quite obvious that it relies heavily on the cute lolly vampire. As for the ending, it's similar to the opening, but in a sleepier direction. Overall, if all you're really interested in seeing is a cute blonde lolly vampire with a cute voice, then it's worth a watch. Otherwise, there isn't really enough to keep one's attention. Hoshikuzu Telepath is a cute girls doing cute things show. The premise is that our protagonist has trouble talking to other people, and often fantasizes about aliens, until one day a self-proclaimed alien joins her class, which then creates enough of an urge for our protagonist to try and talk to her. To begin, the show is pretty slow. Since the protagonist has trouble talking to other people, there is a lot of monologuing and visualization of her fantasies. The self-proclaimed alien also doesn't really help, as she'll run off on her own, leaving our protagonist to simply follow. But of course, this is a cute girls doing cute things show, so whether the girls are doing cute enough things to pass, or if it's not cute enough so it's just boring, will be subjective from person to person. However, the art does live up to the expectation of it being a cute show, so maybe convincing enough for some. As for the opening, I like the song, and the sequencing was tailored for the show. As for the ending, it is slower paced, but colourful and enjoyable in its own way. Overall, I found it not cute enough and simply boring. But of course, those who will watch anything involving cute girls should just give it a try. Hyakuno is a comedy which parodies the harem romance genre. The premise is that after our male lead has been rejected for the 100th time, he visits a shrine for matchmaking, where the god appears before him and promises him that he will meet 100 soulmates. But the catch is that if any one of them fails to get into a relationship with him, they will die. So let's start with the title. If you're like me and only read the title and thought it would just be a really cheap and boring harem show, then I'll have you know how wrong and pleasantly surprised you will be. Now, the first half of episode 1 didn't manage to pull me in, but in the second half, once the girls were introduced, the humour peaked and became very enjoyable then on, as the author expertly uses tropes and subverts the expectations. And unlike a lot of harem shows, the male lead is actually likable, as he has both a nice personality and is required to be aggressive in pursuing the girls. And despite it being a parody, it has probably one of the most enjoyable romance processes. The show is also supported by a cutesy art direction and limited fan service, which let the mood shift between comedy and tantalizing. As for the opening, it's well sequenced, as it does follow a harem type direction, while also incorporating its satirical elements. As for the ending, it takes a much different but still unique and interesting approach. Overall, this is a strong recommendation. Ikinobimasu is a comedy romance in a fantasy setting. The premise is that the female lead fled her country after being accused of a crime she didn't commit, and ends up being saved by our male lead, with the comedy being that, after hearing her sad upbringing, he decided to teach her all sorts of naughty things, which are really just indulgences. However, the way that the female lead ends up staying with the male lead is very forced. While the male lead does have his reason, he can sympathize with her due to his own experience, it does not feel compelling enough. But that's not really the main issue. The main issue is that the naughty things aren't very interesting, nor are they done in an entertaining or comedic way. They all center around the male making threats of self-harm to some degree if she doesn't participate in what he has set up. As for the opening, it's decent. The first half of the opening follows a children's book style kind of art, with the other half following the show's usual style. As for the ending, it's decent as well. It's calmer and romantic compared to the opening, which makes it a nice change from the opening. Overall, it feels like nothing much really happens, so I can't recommend the show. KamiErabi is a 3D action battle royale involving supernatural powers. The premise is that the winner becomes God. So right off the bat, the story follows the uninteresting tropes of an unwilling protagonist who is also nice to a fault and also happens to have one of the most powerful abilities, which means that every fight encounter results in him running around scared, complaining, then winning at the last moment. Because that's just how good his ability is. And all of this is actually acknowledged by the in-universe characters as well, meaning that whoever wrote this story is fully aware of the tropes they're using and how the audience will probably feel about it. The art direction is fully 3D and it doesn't look that great. It isn't absolutely horrendous, but there seems to be some kind of filter or maybe just weird lighting which throws everything slightly off. As for the opening, it's way too saturated, that makes it hard to focus, but the sequencing itself would be passable. As for the ending, it's better since the saturation isn't as intense, but it's a lot tamer. Overall, I would not recommend this, as an unwilling protagonist who just wins the last moment is very unappealing to me. Kamonohashi Ron is a detective show that involves a super genius but quirky private detective and a clumsy police detective. The show does not start off great, as in the first 2 episodes we are presented with 2 cases, both at around halfway through the episode, and is then swiftly solved by the end of the episode. While the examination of evidence and explanation wasn't terrible, it was done way too quick that led it almost to be uninteresting. However, in episode 3 the pacing seemed to have settled down a bit, and we're now in a part 1 of a mystery instead of another quickly resolved case. There is also a very arbitrary condition placed onto the main detective, which actually dampens the believability of the show. As for the opening, it feels fairly standard. It's eventful enough, but still lacking in any interesting and memorable points. As for the ending, it's comparably more simple and plain, but still having that standard feeling. Overall, if you're alright with mediocre crime investigation, and can tolerate highly forced conditions, then it can be watchable, but I would not give this a strong recommendation. Majo wa Tokubetsu is an action fantasy with a theme of school and time travel. The premise is that, just as our protagonist and his party think that they have defeated the final boss, the boss gets up and unleashes a powerful attack against them. But instead of being dead, our protagonist finds himself back at the start of his studies at the academy. Now with the knowledge he has of the future, he does everything he can to avoid going down the same path. So one of the issues that the show quickly has is the lack of intent from the protagonist, or at the very least, the lack of conveying to the audience some kind of plan the protagonist has to alter history. The protagonist is quite aware of the events that will happen, but seemingly just lets them happen as normal, while only changing the outcomes in a reactionary way. Otherwise, the protagonist basically spends the rest of his time just reminiscing about things. All of this leads to a lack of urgency. As for the opening, it's pretty generic for the type of show, but avoids feeling like it was built from a template. As for the ending, it leans into the fan service side of these types of shows, and doesn't really feel special. Overall, not a strong recommendation. I don't hate it, but definitely near the bottom of a watch list. Kimi Zero is a romance story between two high school students. The premise follows the usual uninteresting type of male protagonist. He's unpopular, he only has geeks for friends, has trouble talking to girls, and is nice to a fault, but somehow ends up dating one of the popular girls. The anime could be more easily summarized as Nice Guy the Anime or Blue Balls the Anime, because the popular girl that he ends up dating is innocent enough, or perhaps more accurately, naive enough to sleep with her boyfriend on the first day, as she feels it's her duty. But as expected of this kind of male protagonist, he declines because he wants to take it slow, which he also regrets. The girl is basically shown to have very low intelligence, as she couldn't work out why her previous boyfriends kept leaving her. And her rationale for dating the male protagonist, and each of her previous boyfriends, is because being confessed to feels nice. However, she is actually quite a likable character, but due to her portrayal and the pairing of the male lead, it just ends up not working. As for the opening, it's kind of what you expect from a romance, where the girl is the extroverted popular kind. As for the ending, it's much simpler, but still suits the theme of the show. Overall, this story feels like a mess of incompatible characters coming together and forcing things to happen, so I can't recommend it, even though I do want to like the female lead. Koyaku Wanted is an isekai comedy where the world is actually a game. The premise is that the protagonist was accidentally summoned to another world. To return to her original world, she must work with the Messiah to save the world. So this is a Chinese 3D anime, but it's currently airing with a Japanese dub. While the word 3D may put off a lot of people, I think the style looks good and has smooth animations. For the story, it is a parody of the isekai genre and how the other world is often game-like. As such, there are quite a few references to other games, with the world itself using actual game mechanics such as pausing. While the characters presented thus far are expected, they are still enjoyable nonetheless. As for the opening, it flows well with some good sequencing in some parts. As for the ending, it shares a similar energy though with a different approach. Overall, this is a relatively fun show to watch. While not a strong recommendation, it's still worth checking out if you have free time. Kusuria no Hitori Koto is a drama mystery with a medical theme set in a time period inspired by ancient China. The premise is that a 17-year-old who grew up as a pharmacist is kidnapped and sold to work in the emperor's palace. Despite wanting to keep a low profile to finish her term in peace, her skills are discovered after she helps solve a medical case, which then further entangles her into the inner society. First up, the art is very good. The background art is very detailed and solidly reinforces the idea of ancient China. The characters themselves are also well shadowed, giving them more depth and detail. The pacing of the story is also fast enough to not be boring, but not so fast as to feel like ideas aren't being successfully delivered. However, the main theme of the show is about medicine, and this is where it begins to lack. There's not much depth into what herbs and materials she's looking for or using, nor what their effects are, except when it's described as a final product. We just see some ingredients, some processing, then the final product. But an overly scientific show may not be the goal, but instead the relationships between people may be the priority. There is also a bit of fan service in both directions, with flirty teasing from a handsome male and provocative shots of the courtesans. As for the opening, I feel like the song doesn't fit the theme, but the sequencing is very well done. It's beautiful and activates something. As for the ending, it's a lot more plain, leaving it much less interesting. Overall, I would recommend this show, so long as you're looking for a fun experience and not anything too scientific. Megumi no Daigo is a drama with a firefighting theme. The premise is focused on 3 characters and how they overcome the challenges faced with being a firefighter. As usual with anime, the training and the relationships are over the top. However, rather than it being inspiring or encouraging, the scenes just come off as punishing and petty. And usually with these types of themed dramas, the activities of the real world counterpart get some decent exploration and explanation. But in this show's case, it's almost secondary to the drama, which ends up making the drama unearned. As for the opening, it is very generic, with most of the shots being something that you might get straight from the show itself. Similarly, the ending was also a bit generic, although in this case it gave off a romance-based drama vibe. If you were to watch only the ending without knowing anything about the show, you would easily think that the show was about a love triangle set in a firefighting setting. Overall, I would not recommend this show, as the drama feels unearned and there's a lack of firefighting intrigue. Miki to Dali is a mystery comedy involving 2 twins. The premise is about a pair of twins who have to masquerade as a single person while working towards a true objective, working out who murdered their mother years prior. Upon watching the show, you will get Sakamoto Desuka vibes, if you've seen that show before, and that's because it's actually by the same author. Like Sakamoto in the other series, the twins can perform things to an inhuman level of perfection, although they also have a flaw compared to Sakamoto, in that they lack actual empathy, and so the charisma is merely superficial, which is likely due to their orphan upbringing, hints of paranoia and high intelligence, which is why they are presented in a creepy though somewhat humorous way when they are alone together. The opening and ending are one of the best ones this season, with the opening following the show's art style and is sequenced largely on the twins' ability to mimic one another, making it very memorable and unique to the show. While the ending takes on a children's book sketch style, with the sequence following something like a darker Alice in Wonderland. Overall, I would recommend giving this show a try as it's quite different to the usual mystery. Ojoto Banken is a shoujo romance. The premise is that the female lead is a 16-year-old who is in love with her guardian, who is a 26-year-old yakuza. So it's quickly established that the female lead has an unreciprocated love towards the male. And in the first 3 episodes, that's all we really get from her. Because while we do see her try to move on from her unrequited love, her first outside interaction with a male schoolmate results in her getting into a bad situation, which leads to the male lead having to bail her out of. And this basically cements her as being a bird trapped in a cage, which greatly hinders any potential character development, or organic romantic development between the two. The male lead also seemingly develops romantic feelings for the female lead, but it's done in a way that's very sudden and erratic. The first 2 episodes also did not lead into the next episode very well, ending generally without any hints on what will be in the next episode. As for the opening and ending, they are themed very similarly and are well done, and appropriate for the type of show, although I enjoyed the ending more than the opening. Overall, I don't recommend this show as the female lead's character is very flat, while the male lead's character is indecipherable. Also, a small nitpicky thing is that I can't get over how weird the eyes bend when viewed from the side. Potion-danomi is an isekai mix of slice of life and a bit of comedy. The premise is that our protagonist was accidentally killed by a god, who then apologized and offered to reincarnate her into another world, which she agreed to under the stipulation that she can freely create potions. However, the world that she reincarnates into is a bit different than she imagined. To begin, the art style feels a bit childish. It's a little simplistic, with a sort of chibiness to some characters, although it doesn't go too far in that regard. The story itself is fairly self-aware of the tropes it's using, although it does try to address them in its own context. The world is also fairly safe, given that most other isekai shows are either about fighting bosses, or at least have very powerful beings that the character must contend with. But in this show, there are none of these, at least thus far. The main character herself is actually somewhat enjoyable, as she is quick-witted with her thinking, and doesn't rely on some second character to point out obvious observations, constantly. As for the opening, it's not that interesting. It's largely just a summary of her life before being reincarnated. As for the ending, it's more fun, so it's comparably more enjoyable. Overall, I can't strongly recommend this show, as it doesn't really seem to go anywhere, neither in character development nor in world building. Ragna Crimson is an action fantasy with a theme of dragon slaying, although to be more precise, dragon genocide. While the show follows the trope of a weak protagonist suddenly becoming strong, the rationale behind it is perfectly acceptable. However, I'm still not impressed by what I've seen thus far. The first half of episode 1 felt like it dragged on unnecessarily, given that it appeared to be building up to something, which was then instantly dropped through a plot twist. Again, not bad, just excessive. The next 2 episodes were a bit better, but not by too much. A villain is introduced in episode 2, with a decent amount of introduction, but is almost instantly killed off as though they were just a nameless character, which again feels like an incomplete cycle. And then there's the latter half of the episode, which almost felt like a filler with the relatively useless dialogue. Episode 3 was probably the best out of them all, as the introduction of a new villain is done a bit better, and he also isn't immediately killed off. As for the rest of the episode, it lacked the necessary delivery to pull off the type of scene it's going for, ultimately feeling very generic and almost corny. As for the opening, it's not super generic, but definitely has a few moody standing and turning shots. As for the ending, while I think it is a bit better than the opening, the artistic direction makes it less appealing than it could be. Panning still images can be done right, as shown in the endings in Overlord, but the choices of images just lack the emotional draw. Overall, I wouldn't recommend this show, as it just doesn't do anything particularly well. Seiken Gakuin is an action fantasy. The premise is that a demon lord on the brink of defeat retreats so he can reincarnate into the future for a second chance. But upon awakening, he finds himself in the body of his 10-year-old human form and seeks to investigate what happened to the world. So I like the world building, as the world is now technologically advanced, which is a bit different to the usual shows where technology has barely progressed or has regressed altogether. The show has a very solid presentation with beautifully designed characters and delectable fan service shots. And while the characters may be potentially interesting due to the nature of how their unique weapons work, I do not find it likely that their abilities will be explored that deeply compared to other shows. The story may also appear a bit typical at first, as the world is basically a post-apocalypse, where monsters randomly show up at certain times, with humans in turn living only in selected places. But there are hints that there are deeper reasons for the appearance of the monsters, which may be related to our protagonist's past. As for the opening, it's not very good, since it's just a compilation of scenes you will find in the show itself. As for the ending, it is much better, as it's not just a compilation of existing scenes. Although it is just a montage of still images, it's still something that will fit in the harem show, which this will probably end up being anyway. Overall, the show is going to be tropey, but if you like good fan service and a strong and annoying main character, then I would recommend this. Shangri-La is an action-adventure that's set in a VR MMORPG. The premise is that our main character is someone who's used to playing trash-tier buggy games, but has now decided to try out a god-tier game. To begin, the art is clean and the animations are very good. The fights actually give you the full experience of the fighting, from the setup, the execution, and the conclusion. The environment and NPC characters were also interesting, although kind of typical. However, I think the biggest letdown is that all we get to see is how skilled the player is, without any exploration of how a gamer who is used to a buggy game would behave. For example, something like trying to analyze the attack pattern of an enemy, or trying to min-max his stats to achieve a particular build. Because as far as I can see, he could easily just be an expert martial artist who jumped into the game, and I don't think that setting would change much. As for the opening, it has a heavy rock song to it, kind of like a typical music you might find in PvP videos, with a well-synced video to accompany it. As for the ending, it kind of feels like an isekai kind of ending, with the music being a mix of electric and rock. However, the sequencing is not as interesting as the opening. Overall, if you're just interested in seeing good action in the video game environment, then you'll probably enjoy it. Shy is an action drama involving superheroes. The premise is that people with superpowers suddenly appeared and our protagonist is one of them. Alongside that, a mysterious threat has emerged and now the superheroes need to work together to stop it. And as you could have guessed from the title, our protagonist is Shy. And so far, that's all we get about her. We don't know why she has these superpowers, or even when she discovered she had these superpowers. We're just thrust into the middle of, this girl has superpowers, but she's incredibly shy. Which begs the question of, why would she actually participate as a superhero if she's so shy? Why not stay hidden? It is these questions which make the show incomplete and uncompelling, as the premise works against itself. A girl who doesn't want to be a superhero, but has superhero powers, but is also not compelled to use it, which makes any character growth inorganic. When it comes to the animations and art style, it is a generic good. As for the opening, it is pretty good and fit very well for a superhero type show. As for the ending, it shares similar styles but is much simpler in comparison, though I do not dislike it. Overall, I would not recommend this show, as it doesn't do anything well that's worth watching. S-Rank Musume is an adventure fantasy with some slice of life and comedy mixed in. The premise is a bit hard to explain, as it's about a protagonist who has a dad complex and hasn't returned home in 5 years, but there's also something sinister building up. So the show tries to do slice of life, comedy and adventure, however it fails to deliver in any area. The adventuring is done very poorly, as it is largely just a few images of attacks, and then the target is dead, with the variation largely being only the targets. Similarly, the slice of life and comedy gets repetitive as well. The only variation is the introduction of new characters who all end up in the same place, but the interactions don't really affect anything, at least for now. It is a show that's kind of simultaneously fast and slow, and not in a good way. As for the opening, it is pretty generic, just still shots of people standing around and then a few scenes of characters attacking. As for the ending, it is a fairly simple sequence, and isn't very interesting to watch a second time. Overall, I would not recommend this show, as it does everything poorly. Tear Moon is basically a spin-off of the Reborn as a Villainous genre, but instead of being reborn into a video game, the character has simply time traveled. The premise is that our protagonist is being executed after a revolution overthrows her royal family due to the poor state it has become, but instead of dying, she wakes up back in her 12-year-old self. To prevent the same future from happening, she makes sure to right the wrongs that are found in her diary. To begin, since the character is the person who actually received the bad ending, they are able to recall the experience much more vividly, since it actually happened to them, which is more meaningful for her to change her ways. But where the story falls short is that there is no one to push back on her relatively reformist ways. If she wants something done, because it would likely reduce her going down the original ending, it gets done without any complaints from either her parents or ministers. As for the content, there is, as expected, some amount of fan service and a light amount of comedy. As for the opening, I like it, as it's got this upbeat tune and a bit of humour sequenced in. As for the ending, it takes on a sadder tone, and I don't think the sequencing is as interesting. Overall, this is not a strong recommendation, but maybe worth picking up if you have free time. Toaru-o-san is an action-adventure comedy set in a VR MMORPG. The premise is that our main character is just a salaryman who plays the game after work in his free time, and wants to avoid doing anything too hardcore by choosing unpopular and weak skills. But of course, the skills that he chose ends up being really powerful and helpful because of the changes that the developer makes, which leads to him quickly becoming the center of attention. The show ends up being boring and unbelievable, because somehow we're supposed to believe that a guy who only plays in his free time is going to surpass no-life gamers who would have min-maxed everything while he was at his day job. And despite being a player who lacks PvP skills, he easily defeats another player feed by everyone else in the duel. Meanwhile, all of this is coupled with lackluster art and simple animations. As for the opening, it's acceptable, but won't be something you would bother watching a second time. As for the ending, it's a bit more unique, but still not interesting enough to warrant a second watch. Overall, I do not recommend the show. Undead Unluck is an action comedy with the theme of superpowers. The premise is that our female protagonist, who can bring extreme misfortune to anyone she touches, happens to meet our male protagonist who cannot be killed. When she is set upon by a secret organization, whose aim is to control or eliminate anomalies like them, she decides to team up with the male protagonist as it offers the best chance for survival. So I'll begin by saying that interactions feel very forced, as we are missing something in the dynamics. And my conclusion is that it's because we only have two characters, whereas shows that have similar kind of humor and tone, there are more characters to fill in the in-between personalities, for example, Jujutsu Kaisen and Chainsaw Man. The male protagonist is decently enjoyable, given that he's well experienced with his powers and has an enjoyable attitude. But the female protagonist so far hasn't had enough time to develop yet, so I can't comment on that. The art is also fairly good, with decent animations which don't try to overdo it with effects. As for the opening, it's decently animated and sequenced, and doesn't feel generic. As for the ending, it has a sadder tone and possibly hints at the male protagonist's past. Overall, I think this show is decent. It doesn't stir any particular enthusiasm from me, but it's probably worth a try for most people. Under Ninja is an action show with a subtle sense of humor. The premise is that ninjas still exist in modern Japan, and are still used domestically and internationally. And now we follow a 17-year-old ninja graduate, as threats begin to emerge in Tokyo. Now when I describe the show as having a subtle sense of humor, it means that there are no obvious gag lines, or even things that are supposed to make you laugh out loud. A lot of it has to do with the deadpan wackiness. But that's only part of the enjoyment, because the show also offers some really good action scenes. Well, except for the opening scene in episode 1. As for the opening, it is one of the better ones this season, with a pretty cool song and interesting sequences. As for the ending, it is much more lackluster, as a lot of the moving parts are just video with a filter applied. Overall, this is a strong recommendation, as it offers a much different experience to the usual. Watashi no Oshi is a show that follows the reborn inside an otome game trope, but with a twist that makes it almost a satire. In most of these shows, the protagonist is reborn as a villainess and generally has to avoid getting the bad ending, which is generally dying. However, she is instead reborn as the game's main character. Since there's no need to avoid the bad ending, the twist to this story is that instead of trying to get with one of the love interests from the game, she is instead attracted to the villainess of the story, who actually isn't as bad as she sounds, as her bullying behaviors are fairly tame. So the story is mainly about how the protagonist tries as much as she can to spend time with her love interest instead. As is usual with other shows of the genre, she has knowledge of the world and future events, and can use it to her advantage. And since there's not really a compelling goal at hand, the show is more laid back, and is a fun and fan service laden experience, which should also easily make a fit into the slice of life genre as well. As for the opening and ending, they were well done, with both having an upbeat type of music, with the opening being a bit more goofy like the show. Overall, if you're looking for something casual and enjoyable, I can give this a recommendation. Young Kyodai is a slice of life with familiar drama. The premise is that the Yuzuki brothers lost their parents 2 years ago, and must now learn to live together, with each member facing self-pressure to help the family in their own way. The show is categorized as a slice of life, but it should really be more of a drama. The eldest feels the pressure to look after his younger brothers and the home, as well as handling the judgment from others. The 2 middle brothers also feel the pressure to help out the eldest, with the younger of the 2 being rambunctious and incompetent, which leads to drama. And the youngest of them all simply wants to grow up, so everyone else can stop feeling. The drama in the show just feels very forced and boring. There's a lot of everybody wants to do something, but doesn't really think about how to achieve it. And this is combined with a lot of self-pity. But this show is classified as a shoujo, so that may be the reason why it's done like this. As for the opening, it's okay, although it does thematically feel all over the place. As for the ending, it's kind of interesting, and it's done in reality, but again isn't thematically strong. Overall, I can't recommend this show, as it simply feels like everything is over dramatic. And now for the sequels. I won't go too deep into them, since I'll only assume you've watched the previous season and want to know if it's worth watching. So is Kage no Jutsurokusha Season 2 worth watching? And it's a solid yes. It has everything you expect: decent action scenes, good amounts of fan service, and Sid's ironic or satirical humor. As for the opening, it's decent. Some parts are good, other parts are just okay. As for the ending, it's not that good. It's just like the previous season, where we're slowly revealed a fan service illustration. So is Spy Family worth watching? I kind of have to lean towards no, because it feels like everything is a filler. It's kind of jumped into a slice of life of different characters, with no actual development towards the story. As for the opening, I'm not much of a fan. Feels a little weird for the show. It's well animated, but I just don't like the sequencing. As for the ending, it felt much better, and fits much more thematically with the show. So is Tate no Yusha worth watching? And I'll say yes. It has started on a really good foot, with great spectacles and fights, and introduction of new characters. It's slowly moving towards the next big fight, while investigating the drama that is to be of the other 3 heroes. As for the opening, it is pretty solid, although it feels a bit inconsistent on its emotional invocation. As for the ending, I don't like it. I don't like its art direction nor its sequencing, just seems incoherent. So is Goblin Slayer worth watching? And I'll say yes. It does start off a bit slow, as it's partially reintroducing the main characters and the world. We're also introduced to a new character, although I'm not fond of him, as he's the usual angsty, overambitious sort of character. It does pick up quickly, and we do get more insight on other adventurers as well, along with the usual goblin slaying. As for the opening, it has an intensity and sorrow that is befitting of its theme. As for the ending, the sequence feels a little odd for the show, but I can't hate it.